Welcome everybody to another Sales Hacker community event. So good of you to join us. We're really thankful that you take the time to actually be here for the live version. That means a lot to us. And so if you've been to a Sales Hacker community event before, you know that means we're going to take some time to answer your questions. And we also want you to give the chance to talk to other attendees about this topic today. So to start off, let's do that first. Go down to the bottom of your screen, open up the chat window. And then where that little blue bubble says panelists, change that to panelists and attendees. That way you can see everybody else's chats. They can see yours. And let's just start off by telling each other who's in the room today. So introduce yourself, maybe share your role, your company, your location, your favorite sandwich. Let us get to know each other a little bit. While you introduce yourselves, I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel of experts. So I'll start with Chris Garza. Chris is the Vice President of Sales and Marketing Solutions at Dun & Bradstreet. So amazing experience from Chris. Chris, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Colin.
Yeah, it's great to have you. We've also got Jeff Ignacio. He's the Head of Revenue and Growth Operations at Upkeep. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for having me.
I imagine some folks may know you from your prolific revenue operations posts on LinkedIn. If you're not following Jeff, do it. He's great. And we've also got Jim Lee. He's the VP of Revenue Strategy at Outreach. Jim, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
This is going to be great. Okay, so we've got Ping in the audience, Senior Director of RevOps at I'm sorry, Ping, I can't say that. Oh boy. Well, anyway, they're in Brooklyn. Maybe Ping can help me with how to pronounce that one.
Chainalysis.
Chainalysis?
That's what I'm going.
Yeah, that's it. I think they got
there. It is.
Chainalysis. Got John Glass. He's an AE. Cool. Thanks, Jim. Gigi's here from Germany. Commercial Manager of B2B. Keep that chat active, y'all. So what we planned for today is we're going to talk a little bit. Everybody's going to share some of their opinions, some of what they've seen with shaping data strategies that scale. We've got there's a lot of different ways this conversation could go. One of the ways we want it to go is to help you with whatever you're facing with your sales data right now, and whatever that means for you. So if you have questions, drop them in the chat. I'll make sure they get answered. And let's start talking. So let's go down the line actually first. So, because I know data strategy is a big kind of broad term. What does that mean for each of you? And Jim, do you mind if I'll ask you first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big question. You know, I think when we even had like our pre-meeting, we were talking about, you know, what ground that covers. You know, I think broadly speaking, when you talk about your data strategy, you're fundamentally trying to represent your processes, your market, and your business in some kind of programmatic fashion. So for a lot of you, that can mean, what is the data that expresses my market? Like, what accounts do I have in my database? For others, it's about, you know, your sales outcomes. So you can think classically about that as, you know, your opportunities or where you're going across any motion that you're running. And then really than anything, it's what is then all the metadata you need to sort of support all of those. But, you know, when I think about our data strategy, I'm thinking fundamentally about if I'm trying to evolve my business in different ways, go after different markets and run a revenue organization, what's the information model that I need to run that so that I can constantly learn if we change strategy or if we have a new market strategy, how am I going to represent that? And then underneath that, okay, then what is in the actual plumbing and instrumentation that's required to make sure I can support that? And that you know, you can sort of think about as a data strategy. So as for us and me in my position, I kind of think of it that broadly, although I think for, you know, different operators, different practitioners in different stages of development, you know, there's probably one of those things that's more important than another. You know, but ultimately, when I think data strategy, it's sort of about what's the information model that I need to watch my business and to be able to actually match that to an outcome to get better.
Yeah.
So that's where I start.
Yeah, so that's an operations, you know, I can see your role showing through there that you're thinking data mapping to a sales process, basically. And so, Jeff, you have an operations background too. I'll ask you, how does your view, or like how data strategy takes shape in your mind? How is it different from Jim? How do you think about it?
Yeah, I was just trying to come up with a Webster's definition, so I'm going to read this verbatim. The information and ability to understand the state of the business, operate the business, trend, forecast with information that is accessible, secure, and up to date. Just coming up with something.
Can you read that again? Read that again for me.
Yeah, the infrastructure and ability to understand the state of the business, operate the business, trending, forecasting with information that is accessible, secure, and up to date.
I like that. Accessible, secure, and up to date. Okay, so that's another. Again, very high level data strategy. You're thinking across the business in terms of operating all of those things. This is where it's a good definition. I love it. Thanks for sharing that in the chat. But this is where our preparation conversation, I think, was interesting because Chris, you're a sales leader. And so for you, data strategy means a little bit different for your role. So tell us how you think about data strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's data strategy is such an all-encompassing thing, right? I think we just heard it from Jeff's definition, or I should say Webster's definition, right? But that being said, the first thing that I would say is it alludes to having a data-driven process. So that's fundamentally first a very solid thing. Now, it doesn't always lead to that, but it alludes to the fact that someone's trying to be data-driven, which again I think is best in class when we look at organizations today. As a sales leader, and thinking about the sellers, some of this starts to transform into, depending on the type of seller you are, what that means for you. So, for example, I've led inside sales teams, I've led field sales teams, and now I lead, a team focused on our strategic customers, DB's most complex customers. And, even in the context of the same role, sales leadership, right, but working with different types of customers, it actually means something different. For an inside seller who has, maybe hundreds or potentially thousands of accounts, right, depending on the organization you work with, it means, look, you're after a number. How do I take these hundreds of accounts or these thousands of accounts and figure out where's my growth going to come from, right? How do I look at kind of the broad landscape and pinpoint where's the needle in the haystack, right? And, there's ways to do that, and it requires a fundamental data strategy, right? How can you get specific, a more detailed understanding of your ideal customer profile, and then match that up against the landscape that you see within your portfolio as an individual seller or as a sales lead, right? In a field sales environment where maybe you have less accounts than an inside seller, you're going to need to get deeper, right? You're going to need to get deeper, and it's maybe a little bit more depth, understanding what type of information is going to help you do your job more effectively, right? Help your prospects, help your customers, which ultimately leads to more sales. Does that mean that if your target, if your prospect is a publicly traded company, that you need to dig into the 10K and there's maybe some very specific sections around operational challenges or strategy, right? Or the business description at the beginning of these 10Ks, right? There's gold in there. So part of that is understanding, okay, if I'm a field seller, maybe I'm going deeper on more of my accounts. If I'm an inside seller, I've got to cross the landscape and pick up the needles in the haystack, and then that's where I can go deep. Now, if I'm a strategic seller, right, it starts to mean something different. If now you have, somewhere between 1 and 5, maybe 6 accounts, right, the level of depth you need and the level of understanding you need around data, right, becomes all that much important. So is it org charts that you're after? You need to understand reporting relationships. Is it, what are the different locations within a hierarchy that are making buying decisions where I should be focusing my time and energy, right? So these are all the different things that you start to think about. And again, it's very specific based on not just sales, but the type of sales that you're doing.
Yeah. So that's a good point. And we did, when we were talking earlier this week, we did spend some time talking about use case, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things, Jeff, you brought this up, was that oftentimes you get requests for like, hey, can we get this field or these this data integrated or set up, so you brought up the fact that that's not always directly connected to the actual business problem you're trying to solve. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So there's an old joke that I like to tell, which is you get an elevator and someone's complaining the elevator's too slow. And so all these requests come in and say, this elevator is too slow. What we need is a faster elevator. And so the maintenance company eventually comes in and says, you know what, instead of doing that, they put a mirror on the inside doors, and all of a sudden the complaints go away. Now, people weren't complaining because the elevator is too slow. They felt they were killing time and not using it the right way. So vanity and looking at yourself in the mirror was much better than sitting in an old wooden elevator and sitting around. So the question there is reframing the problem and solving the right problem. So someone might ask you for, like in RevOps, for example, you'll get a Slack message asking for a report or a dashboard. What you want to do instead is ask why. What are you looking to answer? And before you even ask why, you start to anticipate what they're looking for and say, I think your questions are around this. Can you confirm or can you clarify? If not, let's keep going down the rabbit hole, because there are probably questions you're trying to answer that you may not have the encompassing issue of what you're trying to do. So for example, if you want to segment your database so that you can then therefore come up with the appropriate coverage and build out the appropriate team size on capacity, you want to be able to start thinking and synthesizing through what the end requester is asking for. So you want to make sure you're solving the right problem. So data for data's sake can lead you down kind of a lot of the wrong rabbit holes. So my first prerogative is to really understand at the business level. What are you trying to answer? What are you trying to solve for? Let me help you think through and help you construct the problem, the question together, and then let's go look for the answers. And then that's how I think we can build a beautiful partnership.
I love that story. That's a great story. That joke. It reminds me of what in my past, I worked at a marketing agency, and I often tried to use the analogy of a doctor, right? For my reports, I said, you're not an order taker, you're a doctor. People come to you with complaints. It's your job to diagnose and prescribe a treatment. They don't just come in and you hand them a prescription for, Valium or whatever they're asking for. That's not healthy. That's something I think, everybody comes into contact with. In fact, earlier this week, I was having a conversation with Ben McCarthy. He is a really well-known Salesforce consultant out of the UK, runs a site called Salesforce Ben. Maybe some of you know him. And I asked him what the most common thing he has to do when he brings on a new client. What's the most common technical debt? And his answer was, it's almost always, that's right, Salesforce Ben. It's almost always some kind of custom object or custom integration that a client has set up that solved an acute pain, but didn't align with the overall data strategy for the business. Chris, I wonder if you've ever seen anything like that, whether good example or bad example, what kind of maps to you? What do you think of when I bring that up?
Yeah, look, I think that absolutely resonates. I talk about a lot, data is a means to an end, right? Data isn't the end itself, right? And I think sometimes that might get lost in the confusion or in the shuffle, right? When everyone has priorities and you have projects that need to get completed by a certain timeline. And I've talked to customers who are looking to stand up a master data management strategy and platform, right? And, part of my role and my team's role is helping to guide them on the process to get that done. And sometimes, we start to dig in. Again, going back to the example of the doctor, I completely agree, right? We have customers sometimes that want to self-prescribe, and I understand it, right? It's the consumerization. We talk about 90% of the buying journey is done before, they talk to a seller. So I get the reasons why, but the reality becomes, we want to make sure that we're grounded on the end, not the means. So if an organization is focused on creating a master data management strategy and launching a platform, the first questions that we like to fundamentally ask and understand are, help me understand what you're trying to accomplish and what this MDM setup is going to do for your business, right? What are the outcomes you're trying to drive with this strategy? And you'd be surprised, how many of the times the response we get back is, we know that best-in-class organizations are doing it, and I've been tasked with getting this done, and it's part of my goals. I've got to get it done. Okay, so help me understand what's the business impact, right? So I think that's the piece that we've got to ground ourselves on. And even customers, a lot of times, who come to us and saying, look, we know it's going to increase top line. Okay, help me understand, how do you feel like this MDM platform or strategy and leveraging enrichment at the point of creation with an account record? Help me understand your vision. How do you see that helping to drive top line? It's not that I disagree, right? I absolutely agree that type of strategy and that type of project can help drive top line. But again, looking at the means to an end, everybody has a different path in terms of driving that top line. Is it duplicate reduction, right, that's going to help drive some of this? And there's been pain maybe around assignments, right? We talk to some organizations where accounts aren't routed to the correct seller or team. And by the time they find out that something was misrouted, they've already had a customer call, and now that customer has to talk to a new rep, right? Re-engage and go through another discovery process. Now you've got two upset sellers. You got sales leaders that are going, "Hey, why wasn't this routed correctly the first time?" You got customer experience pain, right? Like, absolutely understand that. But it's key to get down to that level of granularity and truly understand what's the end you're trying to drive. Using data as a means.
Yeah, I love that, Chris, and I also, Jeff, I love your elevator reference. And I think one theme that I kind of hear from almost all three of us is that, again, it's almost starting and thinking about the data strategy. It matters, but it's really about what are you trying to accomplish, and therefore what do you need to represent. And I think a huge part of having a good data strategy is knowing that there's not necessarily ever going to be a perfect way that you can represent everything that you're trying to do, be it your accounts, your ICP, with data. There's definitely amazing tools out there, but as with any tool or any data source, part of having a good data strategy is, A, do I baseline understand where I need to go and why? And then B, if I have data that's representing that and I have that and I'm operating on it, how can I know that that data is actually representing what I want? And if there's a gap there, how do I manage that? And then that's the whole art of, I think, managing a good data strategy is there's never going to be like a perfect proxy for what you want to do in data. Like one example always is you want to go after a certain amount of industries. So you pull industry from some provider, be it D&D or LinkedIn or Zoom. Different providers think different things about industry, right? Some of them will take a healthcare software company and call it healthcare. Another one will call it software. And the question is, well, what are you really trying to do? Do you really truly understand the market that you're trying to go after, so that when you get a bit of data and you analyze that, you know what to do with it, you know how to react. So again, I think this is all just to echo what Chris was saying, is the fundamental part of the data strategy is all in understanding what are you really trying to do, and then what do you then really need to represent using data, using the systems.
So let's talk about the hard part. How do you do it? Because I think we can all recognize there is a need for getting down to the granularity, like Chris said, for really identifying the right problem. For deciding a future vision of what you want the data to represent. But in the meanwhile, there's things to get done today and next week. So what's your process internally for organizing yourself to prepare an actual, documented long-term data strategy? Where do you start?
So I start with three core documents, and it's really important whenever you kick off some new initiatives internally. And we have a guest, by the way, so this is my daughter.
So cute.
So the first thing is mapping the customer journey. There's two sides of a customer journey. There's the seller's journey, and there's the buyer's journey. Oftentimes when you go into, say, a CRM, you're going to see the sales stages reflect the seller's activities, seller's journeys. I think one school of thought that's out there is really interesting and compelling is to actually map the buyer's journey instead. That's the first document. The second document is to really put together a systems blueprint. Systems blueprint is a series of mappings that map how systems integrate either point to point and the fields that work with each other, and really understanding how the information flows, hopefully seamlessly, between all the different systems. And the third is going to be a data dictionary. The data dictionary is something that allows, it's an executive document, and then it could also be flavored into more of an IC document. But at the executive level, it's really understanding what are the core KPIs and things that we're trying to measure, and then how do we measure those according to the different systems. Now, what you'll find actually when you go through an exercise of filling out, say, this data dictionary, is you'll find a series of words or concepts like churn or month over month growth or bookings. And it's all defined somewhat differently between some of the different execs. And so what you want to get down to is, okay, what are the commonalities between these definitions? What are the differences? And then maybe if the team is up for it, let's align around this language so that we start to share a common platform across one another when we're speaking. So these three documents allow you to have basically a top-down view of what your systems, how they work, what you're trying to report out, and how it conforms to this, the seller's journey or this buyer's journey. And then after that, the hard work begins. That's now putting these blueprints, these definitions in place that allow the data to flow and be calculated correctly through enrichment or cleansing or merging. And then after that, working with all the different analysts to make sure that they're utilizing the same reports according to those definitions that you've set.
Yeah, I just got to jump in here. So I couldn't agree more, Jeff. And I especially love, how you talked a little bit about architecture. I mean, again, my team and I work with Fortune 500 companies, right? And I can't tell you how many times we've walked into a room having this conversation and it basically asks, okay, help me understand what's your point of arrival. Help me understand, again, the problem you're trying to solve, but also help me understand current state, right? I need to understand what you're thinking in the context of future state, but help me understand current state. And I can't tell you how many times, again, just due to tech debt, right? Integrations built off on top of integrations and, things plugged in, you end up with a spider web that second document you referenced or an architecture can't actually be produced, right? It's a lot of heavy lifting. So again, just another acknowledgement that this stuff is hard, right? It's not easy to do, but there's a payday at the end, right? When everyone gets on the same page around what is an account, right? What is a prospect? What's our workflow? Are we leveraging the lead object, right? What's the prescribed workflow? There's absolute value, right, in terms of getting on the same page, but it's difficult.
Yeah, I think what Jeff said, to start with understanding whether it's the buyer or seller journey, especially for you out there that are working maybe in earlier companies that are still developing this, having a clear understanding of what that is, and then thinking very, very hard as whether you're making a data dictionary, you're trying to come up with an instrumentation of what that customer journey actually looks like, being very clear to yourself of what really is possible for me to represent this, how much of this can I really tackle? Because there's an idea that we want to have fields everywhere and so much data to represent a very rich idea of our customer journey or our funnel. But to Chris's point, as much as you can do to avoid future debt, I think you will do yourself a lot of good if you begin with the end in mind, start with the customer journey, and then as part of understanding any strategy is like, what can you do and what can't you do? So what of that can you actually truly represent in the system? And if you don't have either the right data or system to do that, being humble about what you can and can't do, what you can truly be able to observe and make a decision about as you see outcomes, so that you can avoid in the future a lot of, the debt that you will inevitably build up. But again, I think starting with, again, the customer journey and what you're trying to represent, that's the most, I think that's the 80-20 of it all. And the rest of it is the hard execution and the details. It's very important, but, again, begin with the end in mind.
This reminds me a little bit of, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Colin, I think, I would be remiss as a sales leader if I didn't kind of bring this back to the micro level for sellers as well, right? Because I know we have some sellers, that are out there watching and listening, right? Right. Up to this point, we've talked a lot about kind of the macro, right? The RevOps piece and what this looks like from a master data perspective and business intelligence. But, for the sellers out there, right, there's help for you guys and gals as well. And I think it's really thinking about, what is your ideal customer profile look like right now? Right. So understanding of the customer base that you currently have, being able to understand, based on firmographics and technographics, right, based off of the profiling information you have, what do you know about your customer? And again, I would emphasize, what do you know to be fact, right? That's been proven by data, because I can't tell you how many times I've also seen, a qualitative perspective on the customer base, only to be surprised, right, once a quantitative approach is applied, right, using firmographics and very specific data. So what do you know about your ideal customer profile? right? And then, based on what you see as predictive within your ideal customer profile, how can you go out there and get more prospects that look like that? What's important, right? What data is important to you? If you sell software and you know that you have some very specific competitors, are there competitor installs you can go after by looking at technographic data? If you sell finance software, can you drill into some of the 10Ks and understand financially if there's some accounting issues, looking at the strategy section of a 10K. So again, I know we've talked a little bit about the RevOps space. I wanted to make this real for all the sellers as well, as there's things that you can be doing, right? You've got people like Jim and Jeff who are out there on your side, right, and working on your behalf to give you the information that you need to be successful. But there's also tools and different things you can do, tools like D&B Hoovers that will give you some of that information at your fingertips, right? Where rather than making a wholesale change to the data model that Jim and Jeff have talked about, are there things that can be picked up specifically by you as a seller, right, to add value on top of what's being built from a data model perspective?
I think that's completely right. When you think about the sales motion, you're not really thinking about the database or any of how the data flows. You're thinking about, I'm building this account plan. I have my A's, my B's, my C's. Mm-hmm. I'm working with either my SDRs or my BDRs or my B accounts. I'm working on completely prospecting on my own for this first account. I need to come up with 100-word emails for my outbound cadences to go sequence and send out to these prospects. Once I get that first sales interaction, what do I build into my first call deck? And then how do I tailor that information so that I can bring all the relevant stakeholders based on the organization chart to identify who are my champions, my mobilizers, and that's how you contextualize the information into a usable. You have your sales process, your sales methodology. You want to use that information as a guide to kind of serve as fuel for that journey.
Absolutely.
I have a question on that. So, let's say that I'm looking at my customer profile, right, and I'm just starting to put this together, Chris, and I notice that all of my best, biggest, most profitable, most successful customers, whatever my measure is, all of my best customers have two things in common. They are all under 250 employees, and they're all in the legal industry. Mm-hmm. How do I start to narrow down, that that's not a coincidence, that that those are the relevant data points, that's what makes them an ideal customer, instead of, say, the fact that there's data out there that I don't have, like they all enjoy kayaking on the weekends, let's say. So how do I define what's the most relevant data point that kind of identifies somebody as an ICP?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a number of ways to kind of think about this, but what I would say is that when you think about developing an ICP, there's organizations like D&B who can take your data, right? They can match it to our database of over 420 million records, company records, and append back enriched data to help you understand and to make sure that you're not just looking at, for example, the industry that they operate in, that they're legal or that they're under 250. Can we get more granular, right? Can we actually get deeper insight that your actual sweet spot is between 100 and 150 employees, right? And can we get more specific or more granular on legal services, right? Is there a specific area, SIC code or NAICS code within the legal area that you're actually seeing you're having more success? But more broadly, can we blow this out and look at geography? Are you having specific success geographically, maybe due to regulatory reasons, right? There could be a number of different reasons based off of what you sell. But, more broadly, what I would always suggest is that, number one, base things off of a data-driven approach, right? And you do things quantitatively, again, versus qualitatively, because the data is going to tell you the truth, right? And then the second piece is, how can you make sure that you're looking broadly against the broadest data set as possible, right? You want to make sure that you can match as many of your customer records and you get insight on as many of those records as possible, so that you're looking at a statistically relevant sample size, right, of your customer base, and then making sure that you have a broad understanding of things above and beyond maybe just industry and employees. Are there additional analytic assets that can be thrown on top of that? For example, D&B has data around organizations where buying decisions are made, and we get some of that data a number of ways. But one of the reasons is we also take in trade data in terms of where organizations are applying for credit within another org. So again, if I just kind of summarize, it's, make sure that you're using a data-driven approach, number one, and make sure that you're going against a really broad data set so that you get the breadth of data just beyond some of the basics, as well as some analytical approaches to help develop and refine that ICP.
Yeah, I think I would add a different angle to what Chris was saying is that, to answer your question, Colin, it's always going to be difficult to find out what is like the pure truth, like in your kayak legal example. But to Chris's point, I think another way of looking at it is that you have to make sure you, in some way, can consistently and programmatically look at the patterns that's happening in your business. And one good way, obviously, of doing that is working with the data provider. So simply being, you can just draw a box and grids around the world. And it may not exactly mean, whatever they have labeled in your industry or have your ICP, whether it's exactly true or not, the point is that it's consistent over time, and that as you are managing your business and watching performance go through, it lets you at least hone in on some segment. So you may find out exactly the case that, I think to Chris's point, your ability to even know that it's 150 people in legal, pick a data provider so you can consistently look at least that set. But then the question is, that's more like a breadcrumb how to double click. And in some cases, you might be able to double click and get even more data. In other cases, you just might have to rely on your field, be asking more questions to generate more, understanding and intelligence in another way. But I think that to Chris's point, it's about broad data, but it's about making sure that you pick a consistent way that you look at the world. And you have to accept that it's not going to be perfect, but the fact that as long as it's consistent and you are consistently using that to get better, like that's a huge point. But draw the boxes and lines around it, and be careful and not just add constant data sources just because you think somebody has one data field that's better than the other. Like the consistency, I think, in the operation is key.
So for startups or any company that's launching a new product, you're going to face this anytime. You have a series of hypotheses that are driven by your product development. You're building for a target audience, or this is an offshoot off of a customer advisory board or feedback from your existing customer base. And you may build something that's not just a feature, it's actually a standalone product. And so when you're developing your ICP, one of the most important steps is really just to hypothesize what is your ICP. You're typically going to ground on, a couple of dimensions. You're going to try to solve for what is ICP, and then what is the persona from an actual tactical selling model or marketing model. But in that ICP, there's three areas of the milestones that I think through, at least from a customer's go-to-market model. It's that first meeting when we get in touch with you via email or a call. How do we get you on the line and connect you with someone for a sales coverage model, for a sales-led model? How do we get you to talk to one of us? Or secondly, how do we get you to self-serve and buy on your own for a PLG motion? The second piece is, how do we acquire customers? At what rate? What are our close rates? How long does it take to close a deal that size or industry, whatever segmentation you're going along? So that's the second milestone. And the third milestone, I think, is the most important part, because this is the largest contributor to lifetime value. It's retention for particularly anyone in a subscription-based business, where it's going to be repeat buyers for those in a more consumable model. So when I'm thinking about building out my ICP using data, I'm thinking with the end in mind around optimizing for those three. I may optimize for the first part first. How do I increase the number of sales interactions? And then from those sales interactions, or those product-led interactions, how do I get them to convert to paid, to free accounts, to paid accounts? And then how do I get them to sign up for our subscription? And then in the long run, if you're an annual deal, the proof is in the pudding. In that second or third year, you'll actually see if they keep retaining. So first things first, at the account level, all the normal checks and boxes. We're going to be industry, employee count. It's going to be the technographics. Are there any complementary systems that plug and play for particularly software integrations? At the persona level, very basic titles, personas, where they fit in the org chart, what department they're in, maybe even where they're based. And then you find out more about them once you get in. So for example, in my industry, we sell at Upkeep, we sell maintenance software. And so one of the big things for us is how many locations, facilities, physical properties do they have? What's the square footage of said properties? And then how many maintenance workers are in those? You're not going to find that in a lot of data sources. So we have to be very creative around how we get that information. It may not be accurate. It might be heuristic based. And those heuristics have to be mined and refined and tested over time.
It's really interesting stuff. If you guys don't mind, what I'd like to do is take some audience questions. We've got two really great ones. Chris Orlano, if you don't, some of you might know Chris. He's been a great proponent of people adopting a more kind of forward-thinking approach to revenue operations, designing stacks in a smart way. So thanks for being here, Chris. Chris's first question: how should one go about engineering reports and dashboards so that sort of base level activity and operations data eventually roll up into executive level dashboards? I'll take anybody on that.
I'll take a crack at it. I don't know what the stats are, but I'm going to imagine if you collect every metric that a business is collecting and reporting on, has to be in the dozens, if not close, nearing the 100 mark. Now that doesn't really help, because then, if you're flying a plane, you have all these gauges, you're not really sure, where to look. So if you're an executive, there's going to be a series of gauges they're going to look at, say, this is what I'm focused on, these top 4 or 5 or 6, that gives the pulse of the business. Now, if needed, they want to double click or triple click in. Now you start to see a larger view of those metrics. And so now those metrics might be the core 4 or 5 metrics that, their minus ones might look at. So their direct reports, bless you. And then at the IC level, they might be looking at more activity-based metrics as opposed to at the summary level. So you want to have the right metrics for the right audience. And a lot of these metrics at the top are actually a summation or a trending of the metrics down below. And so I like to think about, what are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve by role? What are the metrics of how you measure success for each of those roles? And then at the end of the day, they're going to roll up to the point where you get up to the executive. So I try to create, role racing matrix around roles and responsibilities. What are their outcomes? And then how do we measure success? And then how does that eventually roll up to these other, kind of parent metrics at the top level?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I kind of just simplify that down for myself because I'm not that smart. I just ask so what twice, with I get the activity metric and then ask so what, and you get some kind of takeaway or insight, and then ask so what again, and that usually means here's what we need to do next, or here's the real trend, Cool. So thanks, Chris, for the question. Second question too. We talked earlier about drilling down and getting to the real problem. Can we get, and maybe Chris, you'd be a great one to answer this, and you work with so many different companies, you see this a lot. What are your tips for interviewing executives? What kind of questions do you ask? How do you get them to that place where you're identifying a real problem instead of just their first request? Yeah,
absolutely. So, a couple things that I'll think about. Number one, there's an acknowledgement here that there has to be a foundation of trust, right? On a first call, you can't go too deep, right, with somebody you've never talked to, unless they're coming to you and saying, hey, I've got this problem, and I think you can help me. Then sure, right, go deep and let's dig in. But if this is an outreach where you're prospecting and you were able to get an executive's time, then I think it's making sure, number one, that it's clear you're aligned with the problem that they're trying to solve, right? And I think we all kind of sound like a broken record to a certain extent, because we keep talking about data as a means to an end and focusing on the end, right? If it's about building a report, okay, well, help me understand, why you need this, right? So back to, again, looking at interviewing an executive, understanding what's the business issue that they're trying to accomplish, right? And I think in the context of value selling, so, at Dun & Bradstreet, we've invested in value selling, which I think is actually a great sales methodology. And the training is focused around a couple things, right? Understanding what's the measurable business issue that this business executive is trying to solve. And think of the business issue as their objective or their goal, right? And then it's going through the conversation and saying, can you help me understand, based off of your knowledge of the organization, what's in the way of you accomplishing your 3% growth objective, right? So again, understanding specifically what they're trying to accomplish and trying to get a quantitative measure of that, and then asking the customer a lot of times for their perspective, right? Because again, we've talked about this where the doctor example you talked about earlier, Colin. A lot of times customers will self-prescribe, right? And I always look at it as my responsibility, my team's responsibility to make sure if a customer self-prescribed, that we actually believe that the self-prescription is the right solution, right? The absolute last thing and the worst thing that you can do as a seller is to have somebody self-prescribe and drop an order form in front of them, right? That's the absolute worst thing you can do if you don't feel like it's going to solve the problem. I say that and we kind of take it in jest, but the reality is there's some of that happens, right? There's some of that happens, and you end up, talking about customer, the full life cycle value, right? Lifetime value. That's where you take some hits. So again, going back to the question, I think it's, making sure that you're grounded on what's the customer focused on accomplishing, what's their primary objective, understanding their perspective on the problem, and of course adding value along the way. And then understanding also what's their vision for the solution, right? I think that's key also. Before you say, hey, I can solve your problem and here's the way I see it, ask the customer, ask your executive, do you have a perspective on how to solve this right now, right? And they may say, well, you know what, I do. Here's the way that I think that I would go about solving this, and that's actually why I'm talking to you. Okay, fantastic, right? And you could take the conversation from there. So I hope that helps, but I think it's really grounding again on what's the end, what's the objective, making sure that you don't go too deep too early on unless the customer has reached out to you proactively, and just making sure that, again, you've got the right interest in mind, because executives, buyers, they see that in a seller.
Yeah, now I can't agree with that more, and I think that a lot of times, this question gets asked, especially sort of ops people, and the immediate thinking is like, okay, this person needs a report, so how do I interview them to get the report done so I can just make the report like a project and get it done? But I think, as with anything, sometimes what folks are asking for aren't really what they're, sometimes they don't even know truly what they're actually asking for. And even if both sides have a perspective, you're not going to get it right the first time. And I think actually being effective in this right is the actual iterative partnership you have. So you start with a hypothesis, you make something, you review it, you watch it, you make a decision about it, you see what happened, and you do that, over and over again to the point where you guys figure out what is the real truth that you need to report on. So, I think in general, there's probably good, overall good professional tips on how to just work with somebody to try to understand, begin with the end in mind. But I really feel like 80% of getting this right, especially when you're in a dynamic environment, is how do you make sure you build that trust so that when you do make something, that you actually look at it, think about it together, and repeat that over and over again, because that's the process in the partnership that's going to get you to a good the right dashboard or the right report or the right insight.
Exactly what you just described, Jim, is kind of what I've used in the past to actually, like, tactically in my conversation with an executive asking me for something, say, this is a process. We might not get it right the first time. Let's be iterative about this. What's our hypothesis? And just set the expectation in that first conversation that it's not going to be magically delivered.
It's not controversial, but it's a challenge to do, especially for the folks that are either operational, maybe they're BI analysts. It's actually not the first inclination to want to do that. It's to like, okay, this person wants a thing, and I'm going to kind of create the report, and that's part of the battle. Sorry, Chris, to interrupt.
No, not at all. Look, I think that I was just going to say. Actually, I completely lost my train of thought.
Happens to the best of us.
I was going to say, when working with executives, oftentimes they have previous experiences or a mental map they can leverage in the absence of data, right? So until they have the data-driven insights coming internally, they're going to lean primarily from what they're hearing from customers, what they're hearing internally, anecdotally from the. You're going to see them interview almost everyone in the company, right? Yeah. If you're a new CRO and you had a sales, what are you going to do? The very first thing you're going to do is you're going to have a lot of meetings in your calendar, and you're not just going to meet with executives. You're going to meet with all sales managers, all the sales reps. You're going to meet with sales operations or rev ops, or whoever you have in place. And you're going to understand what's in place, because they're trying to play chess. They're trying to figure out 4 or 5 moves from now, how do I close the gap of where I want to get to from where we are? But the first thing is I need to know where we are. What's my current state of systems, people, talent, how long it takes to hire people, who's at risk of leaving, what's my pipeline of candidates for people coming in, what are customers telling me, where's the state of my product. So you're starting to assess the business from a go-to-market perspective. That second thing is, in the absence of data, you say, okay, we need a roadmap to close this gap fast. I either need to have a build or a buy strategy around how to close that. So when I'm working with executives about, okay, where are you at in your journey of understanding the problems we need to solve? What's your assessment? And then based on what you've seen, what do you think where we are? And then starting to be a solution provider or a partner and working with them. So a lot of listening, a lot of hypothesizing around different pathways. So one thing I like to do is present options, really, make sure I'm clarifying the problem and understanding it well, and then developing a series of options, because then I'm thinking as a co-pilot to my head of sales or head of marketing or whoever my stakeholder is.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense, Jeff. And going back to, again, making sure that you're patient and thorough in discovery, right? And thinking it from a seller's lens. I can tell you the first couple of times that I pumped the brakes on my sellers and said slow the sales cycle down, they looked at me like I was a Martian, right? It's like, wait a minute, you're supposed to push me to speed the sales cycle up. What are you talking about, right? But again, it goes back to trust, and it goes back to making sure that you're thorough in the discovery, and that if someone is self-prescribed, that you as the seller, you as the sales leadership truly believe that you're positioning the right solution. Once you're sure, then fantastic, right? Let's speed it up. And I'm back to my sales leader hat that says let's get this deal closed fast. But the reality is we have to be sure that we're positioning the right solution that's truly going to solve the problem. Right
on. All right, we've got a really great question from Megan. Thanks, Megan. Let's try to do a little problem solve here. So I'm going to try to summarize Megan. She says the company is ending the fiscal year at the end of this month. They're going to exceed the revenue goal, but miss on the new business goal. And her hypothesis is that is because that reps at her company are responsible for land, expand, and renewal. So what data sources should she look at to validate that hypothesis and communicate to executives that they need to focus on new business more or change that model to hit that new business goal?
Oh man, this is such a good one. The very first thing I would look at is time spent, because you only have so many hours in a day. A rep is going to lean towards I used to be sales rep. I'm going to look at the easiest source of revenue to close it, to hit my attainment goals. Unless you've bucketed your incentive plans, which I'm assuming is not the case here. I'm going to say leveraging the existing customer base is a heck of a lot easier than going after something cold. And that's, and somewhere in between is going to be these inbound leads are going to typically be a low ACV, but a high close rate. So I'm going to start optimizing and balancing my time towards whatever's going to help me hit my goal. You might want to look at your incentives or your comp design and the responsibility matrix of what the role is. You might have just too much on the plate and too little oxygen fed for new business. Classic role of hunters versus harvesters, or hunters versus farmers. That's one of the first things that I would look at. And I think you're probably right. Second, you want to back that up with time accounting. I want to talk to the rep and literally break down how they build their pipeline by time spent. And you'll probably validate exactly what you're thinking.
Yeah, I love that. I think even if you're trying to hit a revenue target, and that's basically being broken down by some form of new business versus expansion, I think part of what you would probably want to also understand too is what is the growth pattern of the customer, and fundamentally, if you're going to hit a revenue target, are you even going to be loading the pipe correctly to be able to actually hit a revenue target? So, I think that the question is, there's no way to actually expand unless you're driving new business. But how do you then calculate all that to know that you can actually hit your overall revenue target? So I think again, understanding what some form of your customer like lifetime revenue, or even just 1-2 year revenue expectation will allow you to basically show that, hey, if we're not generating new business, we're not going to be able to hit a larger revenue target because there's going to be nothing in the pipe to actually generate the expansion. So just taking how is a whole pie going to evolve over time would be another way of looking at it. And we just went through the similar things at outreach, and people love to expand on our platform, but how do we make sure that we actually keep feeding the beast, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would agree absolutely with what Jim and Jeff both said, right? I think part of this is, the first place I went, and I see that, Megan, thank you for the clarification, new and expansion are comped equally, but the first place I went is comp plan, right? I can tell you, comp plans absolutely motivate and drive seller behavior and activity. I've seen it time and time again. That being equal, I think part of this also is looking at the marketing organization. Are there marketing activities and marketing strategies that are driving things inbound? And even going back to some of the things that we talked about at the beginning of the conversation around speaking the same language. What does new business mean? Does new business mean new logo, or does new business mean cross sell, selling new products into current customers, right? So, and depending on which of those it is, maybe there's a different treatment, right? If it's new logos, then it's an exercise. How are you guys identifying what your total addressable market is and taking that again another layer deeper into the serviceable, obtainable market, and understanding, where our marketing dollars being deployed to actually drive those customers in the door through an ABM strategy, right? What's happening there? Is it happening? Is it not? If that air cover isn't happening to drive awareness into new logos, then, well, that makes sense why you're not probably getting a lot of inbound. And if you don't fill at the top of the funnel, you're not going to get much that converts at the bottom of the funnel.
Romy is chiming in here, saying had a similar situation or a similar question, and they think that their goals don't align with their incentive. Right now, their customers provide little growth and are sometimes in contract with other vendors. So new business is kind of their only option for growth. So it can flip the other way. The other thing I wanted to bring up here is that, so Ping threw out an alternative hypothesis, which is that the new business target is actually just too high, and that's why it's being missed. So I imagine one way to validate that would again be to look at the time spent by reps on, new versus expansion versus renewal. And if you see they're spending more or less the same amount of time on new biz as they are on expansion, then yeah, maybe something is broken in that.
I think you also.
Or Colin, I was just going to say, I would also look at that as a benchmark against prior year, right? So, that's the great thing you can do, especially looking at quarter over quarter. If new business is consistent with where it was in prior year, and your revenue growth has stayed relatively the same, or you can look at your new business, in the context of your overall revenue growth rate, right? And where did the expectation go up 30% in terms of new business, but your total sales or revenue target only went up 5%, okay, you probably have a new business target issue.
Yeah. I think you fundamentally have to have an idea as a company of where you expect growth to come from, and then therefore what you need to organize to. So for instance, it could be, I don't know the product that, you feel like you do have an established customer set, then strategically the important thing for the organization to do is to mind that set, understand that, and then potentially move on to a new industry. So maybe for this fiscal year, you expect the new business, new logo business versus expansion. This is where growth is going to come from. So we're gonna make the bet that this is what we're going to focus on to get the revenue and then to learn. It could be another case where you feel like you've exhausted that, so you have to go after, new logos. Again, it's really, I think, more of a question of how do you model where you expect growth to come from, which, it's beyond just an operation. It's a finance thing. Where does, product marketing think you need to go? And I think, again, it all goes back to the broken record of beginning with the end in mind. What do you really have to do? Where is growth going to come from? And then therefore, what model and what do I need to lean on? And then what incentives do I have to have for my sales force to actually go after that?
I think the great thing is, since your fiscal year is closing, you're probably in the middle, if not almost towards the end of your annual planning. One thing you might want to do is have a set series of hypotheses on how the problem sets on a column, and then start thinking through some solutions. Normally, what I would do is borrow something out of product management, which is user stories. I'll set up a 4-column table. What we do currently, what we want to do, and the solution is, and then an implementable timeline around how to fix that. So something that you might want to consider and addressing. Incentives, coverage, air cover around pipeline. So look at this, free consulting.
That's what we came to deliver today, and I think we did it. We're wrapping up here. I think I like being able to give everybody a few minutes back in their day, maybe go refresh your cup of coffee or your bottle of water. or your bottle of formula, as it may be. So thanks everybody for stopping by, and Jeff, Chris, and Jim, thank each of you so much for lending us your experience and expertise today. This has been really just a fun conversation. I'm sure we could hang out and talk about this for 4 hours.
You got it. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks guys.
Yeah. See you soon.